All right, good morning, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Solis and Dean Lindquist for welcoming me here today. It's really great to be here talking with all of you, lots of colleagues in the room. I want to start with, so you heard about our name, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. Many of you are involved in our activities already. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. So starting with a few examples, let's do a quick activity. So I'd like everyone to take out their phones. That's great. Not everyone had their phones out already, so you're paying attention. Much appreciated. So take out your phones. You're going to open up whatever app you usually use for mapping, for getting around. Whatever's on your sort of home screen. Pop that open, and you're going to search for Yumbe, Uganda. Y-U-M-B-E, Uganda. Including directions? No directions needed. Just zoom into Yumbe. Can anyone tell me what they see? Feel free to shout it out. Did you find Yumbe on the map? Yes. What do you guys see? Okay, thatched roof, a few streets. So I see some people are using satellite view. That's great. A few streets. What else? A school, okay. A hotel. A few mosques. How many people live in Yumbe? Can anyone? It's hard to see, right? Well, I'm going to move to a couple of photos. This is nearby Yumbe. This is in northern Uganda. This is a photo our team took recently of refugees from South Sudan crossing into Uganda. And when you guys are looking at Yumbe, what I wanted to point out is that on many maps you can see some basics. You can see some of the schools, some of the mosques, you see a few roads. But it's really hard to tell that 300,000 refugees live in Yumbe. This is one of the largest refugee hosting districts in the world, and it's part of an effort to house over 1 million refugees from South Sudan. So it's really challenging to sort of see that complexity on some maps. And this is, I'm not sure if you guys could read this, but on the right is just some of our text. It's text on WhatsApp from one of our mapping team members who are sort of working with these refugees on a daily basis and encountering some of the challenges that they face. In this case, it's often access to clean drinking water. So there's a limited amount of wells and boreholes in northern Uganda. And one of the things our team is mapping, I'll get to that in a minute, is that access to clean drinking water. And so in Uganda, we're really fortunate because we have 5 YouthMappers chapters in it, and it's still growing. In these chapters, so this is one chapter at Uganda Christian University who are helping to contribute to this global effort of making better maps throughout Uganda and providing those maps to relief organizations and to UN agencies like UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So through this process of YouthMappers coming together in Uganda, the global community helping to map, and then some hot team members on the ground, we've been able to map all of the water points this is another neighboring district to Yumbe, Arua, and you can see we've covered 2,413 water points. And what you see on that, the interesting thing about this map is that you can see which points are functional and which points are non-functional. So the ones in blue are functioning, the ones in red are non-functioning. And what this helps us to do is determine, when you look at sort of population data or individual buildings in relation to this, you can see which refugees have access to clean drinking water and which people are in a distance that's not within a reasonable sort of walking distance to a well or a borehole. And this can help to inform NGOs working in the district where action needs to be taken to fix problems with wells and boreholes. So I'm going to move on to another example. So Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. This is a city that's the fastest growing city in Africa. and has grown, is now around 5 or 6 million residents. Every year there's a period of heavy rains, and during that rainy season, you often see things like this. So many homes are built in locations where when the rains come, you're suddenly sitting in 2 or 3 feet of water. And you can see this kind of on the left, and on the right, you see the other challenge, which is many of the drainage system and the drainage infrastructure gets blocked. So you end up with sort of waste piling up and homes being flooded. So in Tanzania, we're really fortunate to have 3 YouthMappers chapters, and these are some of our best mappers. These are students from RD University, which is home to one of the biggest YouthMappers chapters in Tanzania. They're out actually mapping their city. So we worked with 300 students over the past months from RD, and they helped to create super detailed maps of the places where floods were occurring in Dar es Salaam. So you see that some of the students on the right were actually using sort of homemade tools like rulers and measuring tapes to measure the width of drains and the depth of drains, and to indicate on the map where there were problems with flooding. And through that process, so this is just one ward or one neighborhood of Dar es Salaam. And you can see as this kind of swipes from left to right, this is what the map looked like before. So it was almost completely empty, and this is what it looks like after. So you see the buildings kind of just get filled in. And this happens through a process of remote mapping, so people looking at satellite imagery and drawing squares and polygons around the buildings, and then the teams like the students you just saw in the previous slide who are out on the ground actually adding more detail to the maps. And through that process, so just in this one neighborhood, students were able to map about 5,000 or 6,000 buildings, and they've now covered the entire city of Dar es Salaam, which is roughly 900,000 buildings. This was all done through efforts of students working together with our staff, so it's really, really impressive. And these are some of the things. So the next question might be, okay, that's great, you've mapped 900,000 buildings, what do you actually do with that data? And so with that data, you can actually start to see where the problems are occurring, where the flood trends are occurring. So you can see the map on the left, the buildings in green so those are individual squares or buildings, and the ones in green are the ones that are not heavily affected by flooding. The ones in orange are ones that are actually built in a floodplain. So during the rainy season, those will be inundated with anywhere from 6 inches to sometimes several feet of water. And through this process of community mapping, working together with the YouthMappers chapters, we now know precisely how many homes would be affected. And that information can be used by municipal leaders, and it can also be used by urban planners to determine which areas are most at risk. And the other thing is that we can now take action on it. So this is some of the local activities that have been undertaken once we know where there's problems with blocked drainage. So you see here two projects. There's one called Adopt a Drain, or Tuamataro, and there's another one called Zuia Mafuriko. These are emergency flood response teams. These are led by the Tanzanian Red Cross, and they're using the data that's been collected by this project to identify where there are problems with flooding and drainage. Okay, moving on to Puerto Rico. I think many of you here remember, because this happened only recently, but the incredible challenges we faced with the hurricanes that came through the Caribbean basin this hurricane season in 2017. And Hurricane Maria completely devastated large areas in Puerto Rico, and there was an incredible response from the global OpenStreetMap community and YouthMappers chapters. So one of those many dozens of mapathons were held around the world. This is just one of them, which is at Miami University, Ohio. And it shows some of the students at YouthMappers chapters really coming together to organize events to help provide better data for the response on the ground. And I wanted to show you this slide because it really shows that the data that's being produced by students, by YouthMappers chapters, is being directly used on the ground in response efforts. So this is a photo taken with some of the teams from FEMA, and American Red Cross, who were supporting the response on the ground in Puerto Rico. And if you look really carefully in the background, you can see the wall is completely covered with maps, and these are all maps that are printed directly from OpenStreetMap. So I started the presentation with the question, what is HOT? So all these examples I'm giving are HOT. So HOT is this big global community of people working together. It's YouthMappers chapters, it's young people, it's old people, it's partner organizations, it's some of our staff teams on the ground. And what this means is that over the years, we've had more than 100,000 people contribute to this big global mission of creating better data sets in places of the world that are vulnerable to crisis or disaster. And so these are just a few photos of events from all over the world. Some of these are from the West Africa Ebola crisis in 2014 and 2015 of mapathons that took place. But the point I want to get across to you today is that you are all part of HOT. By being here in this room, you really have the power to contribute to these efforts, and many times you have already contributed. So I want to thank those of you in the room who have contributed to these efforts already. So as you can see, we're working on many issues. It's not only disaster response, it's things like urban planning, working with refugees, refugee protection, providing access to clean drinking water, female genital mutilation issues, prevention of epidemics and control of disease outbreaks. So whatever your sort of interest area is, there's ways for you to get involved, and there's ways for you to help out using open data and OpenStreetMap. How many of you have heard about the Sustainable Development Goals? Raise your hands. Okay, so a good portion of you. These goals there's 17 of them, and you can see them up on the slide here. These are goals that were put together by the global community and are sort of organized under the UN system, but essentially are goals to create a better world for all of us. And you can see they span a lot of the same areas in which we're working. So goal number 1 is no poverty. Goal number 2 is zero hunger. Number 3, good health and well-being. Number 4, quality education. 5, gender equality. So these are just really broad sort of goals for our world, and we have 15 years to achieve them. So they span from 2015 to 2030. So we have a challenge. We have these goals, they're really ambitious, but the challenge is that many people are still being left behind and are not sort of included in the process of getting there. So when we talk about no poverty, that's a global goal for the entire world. But many people are still living in situations of poverty, we know that. So in order to meet these goals, one of the ways that we're contributing, and there's many ways to contribute, is by making sure everyone's counted and making sure everyone's included. And one of the ways you can do that is through mapping and putting places on the map that haven't previously been visible. As part of that effort, my organization, HOT, and many other organizations, which you can see on the slide here, have come together and formed this partnership called Missing Maps. And through Missing Maps, we're working to do exactly that, to put places on the map, especially those that are most vulnerable to crisis or to disaster. And I want to give you a few examples. So when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals in particular, this is goal number 11, and there's a target under goal 11, which relates to cities, and in particular slums. So by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade slums. And so the question is, how do we measure our progress towards that goal? So there's an indicator that's proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements, or inadequate housing. Through the process of mapping, we can contribute to answering that question because we now can tell very precisely how many households we've mapped in a given slum area. And this is a photo from Tanzania, like I was showing you earlier. So we can start to quantify these things and have better answers as to how close we're getting to achieving the goals. This is another target under that same goal, goal number 11. And related to public health, goal number 3, good health and well-being, we can also do things like, once we know the exact location and number of households in an area, we can use that data in OpenStreetMap to start carrying out things like immunization campaigns. So this is just one example. Many of our partners at Doctors Without Borders and American Red Cross are working on these things every day. And so by creating better maps in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo, MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, was then able to carry out a large-scale yellow fever vaccination campaign, which covered 10 million people. And this was all based on data coming from OpenStreetMap. So it's really, some of the data that you're creating and helping to create is really having an extremely powerful impact. This is another project related to malaria. So one of the challenges we're also working on is elimination of malaria throughout the world, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So as you watch this animation, you're seeing areas of the map light up in blue. These are areas that hadn't previously been mapped. There was no openly available data around them. And we had this big global project that was sponsored by the Gates Foundation, and it was run by our partners at Digital Globe. And HOT contributed, YouthMappers contributed to provide better data for organizations like Clinton Health Access Initiative, who you'll hear from a little bit later today. And as you can see, that counter tick up on the left was a really incredible effort. So 5,000 volunteers mapped 4.7 million buildings across 7 countries. And this was covering more than 500,000 square kilometers of land. And as you see those, as the map lights up in blue, if you zoom in there, these are individual buildings and roads that were being mapped as part of that effort. And it can then help us, so the data can help us because when we're carrying out malaria interventions like distributing bed nets or spraying people's homes with insecticide, we now know exactly how many homes are in a given village and how many have been covered by that intervention. So maps can help us to determine all those things. So I'll finish up with just a few. I'm going to give you 5 ideas on, so when you walk out of this room today, how you can help or contribute to this effort. So number 1, when you're thinking about data, when you're thinking about maps, geospatial, think about that in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I showed earlier. And think about which of those goals and which of the targets your mapping can actually contribute to. So this particular one, which I wanted to show, was an effort from Nicaragua, where a local team of volunteers helped to create a comprehensive map of all the bus routes across the city of Managua. And they did this was an entirely volunteer effort. And you can see some of the maps on the printed maps on the bottom right here. This was all done using OpenStreetMap. I want you to talk with other schools and other chapters. So Texas Tech has been really at the forefront of developing this global movement of YouthMappers chapters. Now more than 100 chapters throughout the world, but we want this effort to keep growing. And I really think it's also very important for you. So for the students here today who are members of the chapter at Texas Tech, reach out and talk to other chapters. There's chapters all around the world, including in many of the countries which I showed earlier, who would love to hear from you, and there's ways you can sort of share advice and work on projects together as well. And just one of the ways you can do that, so there's many ways you could do it through the Facebook page. We also have a global community sort of chat on Slack. So if you haven't used Slack yet or haven't signed up, you can go here, slack.hotosm.org, and that's a way you can connect with the global HOT community. You can sort of discuss any of the issues or mapping projects that are happening. You can organize or help at an event. So tonight we have an event. I hope you guys will all be there to do, and I'm sure Patricia and Marcella will tell you, and Chad will tell you more about that a little bit later. You can get mapping on your phone. So if you haven't checked out, we have an app called Map Swipes. You can download that on your phone. And it's a way you can contribute really quickly by looking through satellite imagery and determining which areas are populated or not populated. And you can also, so at the beginning I asked you to take a look at Yumbe, Uganda using your favorite mapping app. If you don't have it already, there's also a really good one that's based on OpenStreetMap called maps.me. So you should also download that on your phone, and that lets you use OpenStreetMap offline even while you're traveling and might be outside of the US. Number 5, you can do internships with HOT. So last year, HOT and YouthMappers working together, we had dozens of interns, sort of virtual interns working remotely on some of our mapping projects and taking leadership roles in those projects. So not only mapping, but helping to validate data and provide some sort of higher level expertise. And so we'd welcome you to do that again. We haven't formally announced the application period, but just if you follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, if you join Slack, you'll be able to get those notifications once they go up. And if you didn't like any of that, there's more info on how you can help to contribute making the world a better place at this site, the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. So check that out. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to Patricia. Oh, questions, okay.
We should take some.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have a question for Tyler?
I guess I was wondering how, if you do anything as far as quality control, do you have maybe multiple people map the same place and see if they come with the same answer?
Right. Yeah, so as far as quality control goes, all our mapping has kind of a two-step process. So there'll be one person, especially the remote mapping part. So one person's looking at satellite imagery, they'll map everything they see, they trace the buildings and roads, and then we always have a second person called a validator cover that same area and validate the work that the first person's done. So in our online tool, the tasking manager, each person takes a square. When they're done with that square, it turns yellow to indicate they've completed it. And then when the second person takes a look at it, it turns green to indicate that it's been validated. And then also on the ground, there's sort of further steps beyond that. So ideally, once it's been mapped remotely, we'll have somebody on the ground to actually validate or check that that data is accurate and that there's indeed a building there, and they'll add additional detail to it, sort of what's the use of the building, what's the construction material, all of those kind of things.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Actually, what are the upcoming kind of campaigns that you're going to be working on in like the next maybe 3 to 6 months, so that our students might think about those places of the world, those issues? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I've shown some of them today. There's going to be another big push in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to collect additional data on the problems with flooding. We're also doing a lot around refugee response. So we're working in some of the biggest refugee crises in the world right now. So Uganda is one of them for the South Sudanese refugee crisis. We're also working on the Syrian refugee crisis. So we have teams that are in Turkey that are working with refugees arriving from Syria. So if you're interested in refugee issues, I think that's a really good way to get involved right now. But other than that, you'll hear from Chai later on some of the malaria mapping work that's happening. We just started a new project in Botswana where we're actually taking the data that's been produced online in OpenStreetMap, and we have a team on the ground that's verifying that data is accurate and adding more detail. So malaria is probably the other big theme coming up in the next few months.
Great presentation, Tyler.
Thanks.
So you gave us lots of examples of what you've done, and you just mentioned focus on refugees. How do you usually make decisions about where to map and what to map?
Yeah, so when I showed a slide earlier on missing maps, right? So missing maps has this, it's one of HOT's programs. We have other programs as well, but missing maps has this big goal, which is to map the most vulnerable areas of the world. And to Carrie's question, how do you define that? There's many vulnerable areas around the world. And what type of vulnerability? Vulnerable to natural disasters, or vulnerable to disease, or vulnerable to poverty? There's a lot of different ways to define that. What we usually do is, because HOT's this global network, we don't necessarily control what our community is doing. We encourage our community to map what's important to them in their countries. So a lot of the efforts that you saw in my slides were started by local volunteers because they knew that an issue was important to them in their country, and they started mapping it. And then our organization sometimes comes in later and provides financial support or other training to those efforts. But we always work with partners at the same time. So all the work we're doing it's not sort of mappers working in isolation. We're working with local governments. We're working with NGOs on the ground and we're hearing what their needs are, and based on those needs, we're doing our best with limited resources to respond to those needs.
On the project in Dar es Salaam, on the flood maps in Dar es Salaam, how are you collecting that data as far as the flood maps? Are you able to use satellite imagery or topographic maps to recognize the flood grounds, or is that all based off people on the ground locating them?
Yep, so it's a little bit of both. There's value to both methods, I think. So we started with, our sort of approach to it is we're using satellite imagery mostly to create the base data on the roads and the buildings and the infrastructure that's in place, because even that didn't exist previously. Our approach has been to sort of complement the remote sensing and satellite and drone imagery. We have done that, but we feel it's really important to involve people who live in areas that are affected by flooding. So the other thing we're doing is, like when I showed the flood map of Dar es Salaam earlier, there's many little dots on that map, and one of the things we did was we equipped neighbors living in flood-affected neighborhoods with using their own mobile phones. We loaded up open data kit surveys on their phones, and they went around and asked other neighbors if they had experienced flooding, when, how severe was it, which I think is really important, because you get down to that micro level detail that you might not get from remote sensing or satellite imagery, and you also hear different answers. So if a foreigner, if like myself are going in and asking questions, you get different results than if you have a neighbor asking another neighbor that same question. So through that process, we were able to see these little pockets of flooding that wouldn't have been sort of detectable otherwise. But by having local people with their own devices, with their own phones, just with adding a little training to that process, we were able to get that sort of hyper-local insight that you couldn't get otherwise. So I think that's really, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be using remote sensing methods. We should be, but we should be also sort of triangulating the results from those with the local results from the ground.
I don't have a question, but I have a request for assistance. And I'm David Driscoll. I direct the Urban Tech Studio downtown, and our focus is on sustainable redevelopment of downtown Lubbock. We have a grant right now. We have a national team coming in the fall from the American Institute of Architects to look at sustainable. It's called the Sustainable Design Assistance Team. And somewhere between now and September, meaning the summer, we really need to map downtown in a way that it's never been mapped. So I don't know who I'm talking to, but I have a card.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic.
Great project for a chapter.
Yep, it does indeed sound like it. There's a really strong, within Texas and even throughout the United States, there's a really strong OpenStreetMap volunteer community. So I'm sure there's lots of motivated volunteers that would like to contribute to that.
We'll connect you to our chapter president back there.
Yep.
Another question? I do have one more question. I'm sorry, but we do have time for just one more question.
Sure.
So one of the things I think that is really brilliant about the relationships with YouthMappers and HOT, YouthMappers being sort of the representation in the academic community. Mostly we're focusing on students, but also they have faculty who advise them and also teach them in their other classes. One of the brilliant things I think of is this opportunity to actually take that data and these relationships that we have to get students research very heavily involved in real world questions. It motivates my students a lot, and then it also produces knowledge from that data, from that relationship, from that exchange that maybe might answer some really important questions. So my question is, you have a very good finger on the heartbeat, the pulse of the humanitarian community. What do you think is one of those questions that is sort of a persistent question that might be good for a research project or a student master's thesis or a student PhD dissertation that could, kind of advance the kind of things you're trying to do with the knowledge end of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when we think about HOT, I'm very much sort of operational minded. I'm thinking about how are we going to respond to this crisis, or what sort of staff or volunteers do we need to get working on this given project, which means I don't often have time to think about research in the academic side, so I would very much welcome those kind of partnerships. We do have one student, a PhD candidate from Nottingham University in the UK, working with us right now on the topic is sort of big data, and how can big data from mobile phones, call data records be used to sort of in combination with the data we're collecting on the ground. So that's like, for me, those are some interesting research questions, but maybe how do we look at using other data sources in combination with the sort of crowdsourced and locally produced data. So data from satellites, data from social media, data from mobile phones, all of those kind of things. That's a big question at the moment, is how can we combine these data sources to improve humanitarian response. But beyond that, I know many of you are researching in specific areas, whether it's environment or public health. I would welcome your ideas on what you're working on, and we can think about whether it might match up to one of our projects on the ground.
Last call. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Another round of applause.